From the Spec Network, this is Fragmented, an Android developer podcast where we talk about building good software and becoming better Android developers. I'm Don Felker.
And I'm Kaushik Gopal.
Welcome to the show.
If you work on an Android app, and if you're listening to this podcast, I'm going to presume you do, you'll know that when your user reports a problem or a crash, it's the absolute worst feeling. To make matters worse, they might one-star your app, go on Twitter and complain about the app, and if they're feeling particularly merciless, probably go on Reddit or something and post it there. But you know what? They have absolutely every reason to. If you treat your customers basically as an offsite QA team, it's rude to them and it's just bad for business. As developers, we don't want to rely on customers to report errors. Instead, we want to catch this much early on. Ideally, you just have automated tests and these tell you when there's a problem. But as we've talked about on the show multiple times, that's not always as easy as we want it to be. Because writing tests can be hard. That's why Sentry, our sponsor for today's show, tells you about errors in your code before your customers have a chance to encounter them. Not only do they tell you about the errors, they also give you helpful details that help you fix these errors. For example, how many users were impacted by this bug, the complete stack trace if it's a crash, the commit ID when this error was released, the engineer who wrote this line of code that was busted, that and a whole lot more. If your code is broken, let's fix it together. That's Sentry's tagline. Love it. You can check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Sentry is a pretty common word. It's actually a pretty cool name for the service if you know the English meaning of the word. But I want to make sure you get that domain name right. It's sentry.io. Once again, sentry.io/for, as in FOR/Android. Check them out today and fix your errors before your users encounter them. Thanks for sponsoring today's show, Sentry.
This episode of Fragmented is brought to you by Nevercode. Nevercode is a CI/CD platform for Android, iOS, React Native, Cordova, and Ionic apps. Now, back in 2018, December to be exact, Nevercode launched what's known as CodeMagic, which is a CI/CD platform for Flutter apps at the Flutter Live event, which was held by Google. Now, if you're interested in testing, building, and delivering Flutter apps, CodeMagic allows you to configure your CI/CD pipeline to build, but also to deploy and configure various different flavors of your one app depending upon various different custom scripts that you can provide at any stage along in the pipeline. After their initial release, they analyzed over 13,000 Flutter builds and found that the developers are building, testing, and releasing their Flutter apps in record time with CodeMagic, the average build time being around 6.5 minutes. And they're super proud to be a dedicated tool for Flutter to achieve this result. You can read more about this process at blog.codemagic.io. And you may not know what CodeMagic is. CodeMagic is kind of a code signing tool. It's a superpower that they basically have. And they recently released this for Flutter apps. Now, meaning that you can actually create your Flutter apps in an iOS version without owning a Mac at all, which is huge if you don't own a Mac. CodeMagic's automatic code signing feature is not just for people without a Mac either. It just simply takes the pain out of the entire process by yet automating another aspect of app development. And you'll know this firsthand if you've ever deployed or developed any type of cross-platform app. You have to deal with this ridiculous iOS code signing stuff, and it's just a nightmare. CodeMagic's not just for hobby developers or one-man teams. It's for companies, development agencies, larger teams, and just several developers who are contributing to a singular project or even multiple projects. Now, with its latest feature, CodeMagic CI/CD for Flutter allows you to take your app to the next level by giving each team member a complete overview of the app's settings and builds from end to end. Now, in short, if you're looking for a CI/CD tool for Flutter apps, CodeMagic is where it's at. So check out CodeMagic if you want to build kick-butt Flutter apps in record time. Again, you can check them out at nevercode.io or codemagic.io. Kaushik, I'm pretty excited today.
I am super stoked, but why don't you go ahead and tell us why you're super excited today?
I'm super excited today because we're getting to talk to someone that I've been wanting to talk to a long time. You've been wanting to talk to a long time, and we've been talking I think on and off with this individual for quite a while now about possibly having him on the show. And one of the reasons why I'm really excited to have him on the show is this is someone who has done, a lot in the realm of Android development. A lot of people kind of look up to this person as, hey, this is someone who's doing the indie development thing, who's making a living off of it, who is actually developing the application and being able to do stuff other than just working for a full-time company and having a side project. And so it's just really exciting to actually be able to ask this person a lot of questions. So without further ado, Chris Lacy, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
It is so much fun to have you on the show, Chris. Typically, we always get to meet each other only during I.O., because otherwise it just so happens that our time zones are like kind of out of whack with each other. So has been so difficult to like have that on. But we are super excited to be able to chat with you today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Now, Chris, for the longest time, I've been following you on Twitter for, I don't even know how long, I probably since very early on. So I know a lot about a lot of the apps that you've developed and things that aren't even in your profile anymore when people look at your profile. So if for folks that are just coming to this conversation now, people coming to the, Android development for the first time or just kind of learning about this stuff and are not familiar with who you are, would you mind giving a little bit of background about yourself, what you do, maybe some of the apps that you build?
Sure. Well, I'll start by mentioning I made video games for 10 years from basically 2000 to 2010. Wii, GameCube, PS2, PS3, that sort of stuff. But then I got interested in mobile, like most people. I had an iPhone, really enjoyed using that for the longest time. Then iOS 4 came along and completely neutered my previously lovely iPhone 3G, and there was massive stock shortages with the iPhone 4. So I started looking at Android and thought, all right, I can buy a Nexus S now. Actually, no, it was a HTC Desire was my first Android. But yeah, so I got an Android phone, and then quickly decided that I didn't like the Twitter apps, and started looking into it. Like I hadn't written any Java code at that point. Most of my time was, all of my efforts in game development was in native code in C++, which I can tell you I do not miss one single bit. And then I had a sort of day job that I was writing an iPad app, but increasingly, I had the Android phone. I was just more and more interested in Android development. There was, even back then, there was a pretty strong open source community, which I think certainly stems from the fact that Android itself is open source. And you could just take an existing system app, or you could take this view pager library or whatever it was, and get something up and running really quickly. And I thought that was really exciting. And so you take sort of the state of the development ecosystem there, and my desire to just write a Twitter app that I enjoyed, and it basically just sort of went from there.
So you created a Twitter app. What is that Twitter app still around, or what was the name of it?
Technically, it's called Tweet Lanes. It's still in the store, but I really need to update it because it's currently sitting there, and Twitter changed their APIs, and I haven't looked into what's involved in getting Tweet Lanes to work. So it's pretty useless at the moment. But so Tweet Lanes was a good exercise as far as learning. It was my goal there was because Tweet Lanes came around basically at the same time as Google first published their Holo guidelines, which was actually a pretty exciting time in the Android ecosystem, because before then it was a wild west, really. Like I don't think
it was.
There was literally no guidelines. So I just thought, okay, well, that kind of almost means the app can somewhat design itself. Like I don't need to think about a certain number of design decisions, because I can just consult these Holo guidelines. So that helped me develop Tweet Lanes. yeah, so I sort of did that for a while, and then started to discover, Android's customization options, especially around launchers. And I really disliked the stock Android launcher at the time. They'd had this, paging all apps drawer that I just thought was awful. And I just thought, oh, well, these guidelines have just come out. And the action bar is a really big piece of these guidelines. What would a launcher look like with an action bar? And so I wrote Action Launcher. Like, that's how much thought went into it. Had I known, had I known that I was, that it would necessarily go that, I would be doing the app, 5+ years later, I might have given it more thought. But that's sort of the short version of how we got to Action Launcher.
Wait, I mean, it's crazy because I remember Action Launcher was like my first introduction. That's how like I got to know of your work. I had heard of Tweetlinez and its loyal following, but Action Launcher is definitely like how I got into like seeing some of like Chris's work. And yeah, it's crazy to think that it just started with like such a simple idea. But you say that like in jest, Chris, but like who knows? Like sometimes the best ideas just spur out of that, right? Like maybe if you put in too much thought into it, you're like, it probably wouldn't work. So you wouldn't have like given it its fair chance. So
well, that's definitely that's absolutely true. And I think one of the things that I actually wrestled with, and I know we'll get onto my new app ActionDash a bit later, but one of the things that I found myself struggling with when it came to ActionDash's release rather, was I feel like the standards for what's involved in an app have grown, and the state it needs to be in when it launches and that sort of stuff. But I was sitting on a version of ActionDash in certainly mid-November last year. That was way more polished and way more feature complete than any V1 of any app I've ever done. And I find myself wrestling with it. It's not good enough. And what I kind of almost likened it to is, how you discover one of your favorite bands and their first album comes out in, they record it in 3 weeks. And then all of a sudden, by the time they get to their third and fourth album, they're spending, 9 months recording and all that sort of stuff. And as a fan, you're just like, can't we go back to the old days? I like it when you put that stuff out quickly. Yeah. So that was something I really wrestled with. But it certainly is interesting to chart the difference in mindset as far as the state an app is now compared to what I could get away with back then.
So you went from Tweetlinez, and then I thought you did another app in between there, didn't you?
Yeah.
Well, no, I went Tweetlinez, Action Launcher, and then there was Link Bubble.
Link Bubble, yeah.
Oh, so it was third. Yeah. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. So Link Bubble was for those who don't know that one released in 2014, and that was essentially a web browser that would intercept your links that you intercept your clicks through Twitter or wherever. And then load that web page in the background, because who wouldn't rather keep reading their Twitter feed rather than watch it go from Tco to Bitly to ny.tms and do those 7 different redirects and then start the page load. It just felt really obvious to me that it was better to keep reading Twitter during that time, and thankfully Android's APIs allowed this. Like, this is certainly one of the reasons I really enjoy Android development, is because I just feel like there's so much opportunity with the APIs that's not available on iOS, and I feel like a lot of the time that's not going to be explored by bigger companies because bigger companies might have, most of them would have VC funding, and the VCs are walking around with iPhones, and they want to be able to use their, the app that they're funding. So there's a lot of Android apps end up being lowest common denominator, and that creates an opportunity for me to play around with APIs that maybe people haven't used too much. And Link Bubble was, I think, a good example of that. I think Link Bubble was a bit of an exception because Link Bubble was not supposed to work. Like I remember, not long after I released that, I went to I/O for the first time, and I spoke with some members of the Android framework team, and they just told me, "Oh man, we were stunned that actually worked. That was not supposed to happen."
Oh,
That's
wow.
fascinating. Wow, Link Bubble was one of my most useful apps at the time. Like, I just loved Link Bubble because it's exactly like you said, it would enable such quick browsing. And at the time, it was during that peak when folks started to like realize how powerful having like good internet connections on their phones were. And so you could just like go browse around, and like having something like Link Bubble was like godsend.
Well, it was even great, if you had a terrible connection, because if you were, on a train, you could queue up some links
Right.
before you, go through and lose your connection. So,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it was a fun project to work on, and eventually I sold that to a startup called Brave, who
Oh, really?
Ah.
It's a Brave.
yeah.
Mhm.
So and Brave is still going well. Like I actually switched my default browser. I've used it on mobile for ages, and I've switched on
Mhm.
Mac now. So
Wow, that's nice. Yeah, I'm currently using Firefox mostly like for the privacy things. But you would suggest giving Brave a shot as well?
I think it's good. I think it's I have some thoughts on how it might improve, and I was sort of fortunate enough during the sale to sort of get
Mhm.
to know Brendan Eck, who
Yeah.
was the inventor of JavaScript, and he's the CEO of Brave, and so
Wow.
yeah, I might send Brendan a message with some some comments there. But yeah, I think what Brave are doing is interesting, because there's I think we've learned a lot about privacy and that sort of stuff in the last 18 months, and I think someone really approaching that with a fresh perspective is, it should only be supported.
That's interesting. There's so many questions and so many directions we could take this. I mean, just
Yeah,
like
I know. Where do we start?
exactly, like kind of where do we start? I guess the first one. I want to loop back with some questions around Link Bubble and like how you decided to sell it and how that happened.
Sure.
But first, I think let me rewind a little bit and say, all right, you went from being a game developer for many years, and then you kind of got to Android. Was it kind of your first intention to say, hey, I'm going to just become an indie developer? Or was it kind of like, hey, I got a nest egg saved up in the bank. Let me just try developing a couple apps and see what happens? Or what really made this a viable means of, of income and a way of life for you?
Yeah, did that aha moment just like happen, like Don's asking, or was it more like a gradual one fine day, just organically,
Yeah.
the next thing you realize you're an indie developer?
Basically what happened was I released Tweet Lanes, and there was no monetization in there. And this was sort of around the time that Twitter had put out warnings saying, if you're developing a client, we recommend you not do that. So I knew I had a short window. And I intentionally didn't put any payment or anything in there. But what I did was try and encourage people to follow me. So essentially I tried to, I had quotes from Jeff Bezos in my head at the time, saying, how they play the long game. And I thought, okay, well, I'll play the long game. I'll give Tweet Lanes away for free and hopefully build up a name for myself. And then the next app, maybe I'll be able to, monetize that one. So that was baked into Tweet Lanes from day one. And that sort of ended up working, so that when it came time for Action Launcher, I had enough. I just had enough followers on my own at the very least to help promote the app and get people using it. So that certainly helped. But Action Launcher was only being done part time. As I said, I was working full time as a iPad developer.
Oh, okay.
But I certainly didn't enjoy that. And it had nothing to do with it being, well, I was going to say it had nothing to do with it being on iOS. It wasn't iOS itself. I wasn't loving the project, and I didn't enjoy the code base. It was like this really heavy C++ STL, and it's
Oh yeah.
One of the things that I hate most about I'm really conscious of and I really dislike as a developer is feeling that I'm not productive. And when I'm spending all this time like fighting tools and, digging down 5 layers just to see what's in an array. It was just driving me crazy. I did not feel like I was nearly as productive as I might have been. And so I really didn't enjoy that. And then you compare that to how quick and easy iteration was on Android. TweetLanes was a relatively small project. In Eclipse back in those days, it would compile a project in the background. So you'd write the code and there wouldn't even be this compile step like there is in Android Studio. You could essentially run it and there was no messing about as far as containers you were using. Like it was very, even in Eclipse, like it was easy enough to debug. So I just found that really liberating, and I was able to iterate really quickly on first TweetLanes and then Action Launcher, and basically Action Launcher got to the point where it was selling enough. I was making a decent enough supplementary income, but then it got to the point where I couldn't work a day job, a night job, be a present father, get up at 2 a.m. in the morning to watch Manchester United on the weekend. Something had to give. And so I just felt like with the day job, I felt, okay, I think I should be able to at least match my previous salary if I go at my apps full time. And so I went for that basically.
So you kind of took that risk, but let me ask. So when you first put out Action Launcher, was there monetization built in it from the first launch of that? Okay.
Yes. So Action Launcher, initially it was paid only actually, and then I switched that SKU to be a pro key because this was before in-app purchases and that sort of stuff. And But yes, so Action Launcher was always sold from the start, and as I said, the main thing was I felt like if I was on it full time, I'd be okay, and it was certainly a risk because I had young kids, and there's never a great time to do that, but certainly when you have young kids, that's a really dicey one. But at the same time, like there's nothing quite like not having a backup plan in a sense. There's been a lot of studies about that, where if you, I think an example would be like typically a lot of innovation comes out of startups rather than like you might see Google create a sort of startup incubator inside Google itself with Googlers. Mm-hmm. But there's a very big difference when you are building a company and it will amount to nothing. Compared to when you know that if this doesn't work, I'll just go back and work for YouTube or something. It really changes the mindset. How quickly you work, and having something to lose like that. It's a motivator in itself for sure.
It is. I can attest to that firsthand. I remember it was 2008, and we had just had our first child. And I had the opportunity to become an independent developer. And it was just, like you said, there was never a right time for it, especially when you have a brand new child lying around. It's like, all right, well, here's the opportunity. I either take it or I don't. Like, this is something I've always wanted. Like, and my wife was very supportive at the time. So, if there's a time, let's do it. The worst case is you can just go get another job. And so that's what we did. And so here we are, 10 plus years later. So I definitely know that feeling, hands down. But quick question in regards to when you did take that risk, had you already matched your salary, or was it like kind of, hey, we've hit that 85% mark and I think I can make it up over the next month, or were you already making more?
No, I definitely hadn't matched, and I hadn't gotten to 80. I think I was probably closer in the maybe 30 to 40%. But
oh wow, look at you go!
But I was I knew that I was not working full time on this. It was when I had, when I sort of did the math and thought, if I did this full time and maybe I rounded up at 10% or something to try and make it seem better in my head. But it definitely wasn't a case where I had, I was matching my salary at the time. There was a risk that I took at the time, certainly.
But in your mind, you were very clear about the direction that it was going in. You were like, oh, I know that I can essentially put in the work. And like, if I just add more work in this, I would basically be able to like, I guess like my question more is, was it clear in your head then that you just needed to spend more time and potentially add more features to sort of like bump that level up? Or was it more around spending the time to just make sure that you're like advertising or like getting the product out there? Or was it just like a combination of multiple things?
At the time, it was definitely just I need to spend more hours on this. I need to add more features so I can release more updates. So because every time you do an update, there's a bump in sales. So it was really that simple.
Oh, wow. Okay. So, I mean, and does that hold true even today? Like, because that's like the common question that most folks ask, right? Like, oh, like the market is saturated. It does like having more updates really matter other than keeping the existing users happy? But you're saying it probably matters a lot.
Well, it does for me. But I think it's worth stating that my apps are somewhat atypical. Like I'm not releasing a calculator app.
Right.
And with each update, I try and make it add something exciting, hopefully something new that hasn't been done before, and that sort of gives blogs a reason to cover it because it's and that helps with promotion and so the circle goes.
So this app that you had, Action Launcher, it's been around now for 5 years. I imagine that it's written in Java. Do you have any new stuff in this app at all, like Kotlin, or is it still all Java?
There's a couple of libraries that use Kotlin that I'm looking at.
So, like, if you check a percentage of the binary, there's Kotlin in there.
No, I mean, look, Action Launcher is a Java application, and that's something that I really, really want to change, especially because ActionDash is 100% Kotlin. So it's been
nice.
It's been excruciating going back, frankly.
I know that's how you get people to move. You just get them to work on Kotlin for a month, and then the next thing you know, they're like, I'm not going to work on that Java piece. Like the only PR I will put up is converting that legacy piece of code to Kotlin, then working on it.
Right.
Yeah, it's and for me, it was just such an eye opener. Just like how often in Java you just end up doing the same things over and over again, and even how much time you waste. Instead of writing var, you have to for the longest time I didn't even bother writing what the variable type is. I just write int and then command enter to just have Studio fix it because I just
that's awesome.
But
I like that.
But yeah, once you've gone to Kotlin, it's very hard to go back.
Following up on like a similar question that bridges indie development and like the actual development world, right? When we get down to brass tacks, how much time do you spend? Because as we talk about this Kotlin stuff, the other thing that comes to my mind is, how much time do you actually spend focusing on things like Dagger, dependency injection, modularization? I know sometimes this is a luxury, especially when you work for a different company where you have enough people and can focus on that. But as an indie developer, is this something that you think you can justify spending the time? Because it never gets as real as what you do, right? Like you're like, hey, the time I spend directly, influences if I can hold the roof, up my family's head. So you're forced to make that decision. So how does that play out in your head?
Such a good question.
It's a constant battle, honestly. Certainly on the dependency injection, I have a very specific answer there. I remember there was a time with Action Launcher where I was upgrading the base code from, I think it was Android 5.0, and I upgraded it to Marshmallow. And so I basically did the upgrade, and that was relatively painless. And then over the Christmas period, at the time, because to digress momentarily, one of the things that I do struggle with a bit, or wrestle with is a better word, is I don't necessarily have the hallway conversations and that sort of stuff that you do, where you get to pick up other bits of information and that sort of stuff. And so I rely, on a few different areas for that. Certainly, like the Android Weekly emails and that sort of stuff are helpful there. And there's a lot of exposure out there, but you just have to seek it out more. In my case, but I came across, really started digging into Dagger over the Christmas break and thought, okay, yeah, I want to integrate that into Action Launcher, and it ended up just costing me so much time. Like that was, and it's only my own fault, because once I had integrated Dagger in one module, I just wanted to put it everywhere. And honestly, that's part of the reason why I'm just trying to be very mature with Kotlin's integration into Action Launcher. Is I don't necessarily want to fall into that trap again, but I think it would be far less of an issue really with Kotlin, because the tools are so good as far as just being able to convert any file to Kotlin and the interoperability. So but yeah, so I did burn a bit of time just on essentially an engineering nicety that in hindsight really wasn't worth it. But frankly, there haven't been too many of those, and I don't begrudge myself that too much. It was a learning exercise, and it's held me in good stead now. I mean, with ActionDash, it was so simple to integrate Dagger, and especially once you start integrating it in testing, it really just improves your development processes and speeds. And so I don't necessarily have too many regrets there.
That's cool. That's that's such a great question. I'm so glad that you asked it, and thanks for the honest answer there, because I can see this being a place where you can burn a lot of time. But I think it's time to ask about your new app. What is ActionDash that you've just recently released?
So yeah, ActionDash is essentially it takes Google's digital wellbeing app as a starting point, and similar to Action Launcher, how Action Launcher offers pixel launcher features and brings them to all phones, and offers advanced customizations and new features and settings. ActionDash does a similar thing in that it brings the digital wellbeing tools to all Android phones, Lollipop and later, and just allows you to visualize your app usage.
So now, is digital wellbeing not available? Like, I have a Pixel 2, so like to me, it's just always worked. Is it not available on other phones?
It's only on. It requires Android P, and it's not even just an Android P issue. Like Pi, so Essential and OnePlus devices are on Android Pie, but they can't get Google's app. It's only on Pixel and Android One phones. I don't know if that changes at some point, but for now, it's ActionDash has a similar feature set in some ways, and then has advanced features and customizations that aren't in digital wellbeing. Certainly, I think I find the daily usage report notification interesting, which you set to come at 8 p.m. at night or whenever, just to get a sense of how much time you've used the app. And I would certainly say I have a lot of ideas of further enhancements to the app, which I'm looking forward to exploring in the future.
What was your inspiration for making this app?
Honestly, the idea was tickled way back before I even wrote Link Bubble. Android 4 had these APIs for get recent tasks, which was mainly used for debugging. And then I think once Lollipop came along, Google got rid of those because I think multi-window was starting to come in, and they were only ever meant for debug API, debug usage anyway. So my sort of little prototype didn't work on Lollipop, but I was more interested in Link Bubble at that point. And then after Link Bubble, I was more interested in rewriting Action Launcher. So I kind of felt like I'd missed the boat on the app, to be honest. And then last year was a really key year with both Apple and Google announcing initiatives in this space. And And when Google announced theirs at I/O, I was sat in the boiling sun, just thinking, "Oh God, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do this way back then?" When,
Hindsight.
but it occurred to me, not it didn't take too much thinking to think, well, hang on, I can do a similar thing to what Action Launcher does. I can bring these features to all devices and try and make them better. Offer advanced features and customizations. So that was that. That was largely the motivation, but it was also tickled from watching, Apple and iOS keynotes over the years where the presenters would come out and say, and, we check our phones 80 times a day. And I just thought, well, I wonder how many times I actually check mine. And there was no way for me to find out. So that was sort of the seed that started the initial demo way back when.
That's fascinating. I have like a follow-up question to this, because I know you mentioned this in passing before as well. You said like you had a lot of these done like mid-November or something, or like from last year. How long did it actually take to build ActionDash?
Well, I started development on it, I think it was the first week of September. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it was the first week of September. And I spent the first couple of weeks just essentially seeing if I could use Android's usage stats manager API, which is and seeing if I could get the same results as digital wellbeing. So there was a bit of time as far as essentially exporting that data, exporting my usage data, right, and then just writing unit tests to pass that and see if I could display the same results, because I knew if I couldn't do that, then I was DOA. So once I got that going, then and I should also mention, for the longest time it was just me. But around, when was it? I think about 18 months ago, that was when I brought someone else on for additional engineering help, which definitely helped me sort of move faster. And then that was something I should have done earlier, frankly, because increasingly I did feel like I was spending a lot of time on stuff, on tasks that needed to be done but didn't need to be done by me. And so it was really helpful to sort of have extra engineering help. And so basically once I was confident with the prototype that I'd built for ActionDash, that's when it wasn't, after then it wasn't just me working on it. But it was, yeah. So, but the app didn't exist at the start of September, so I guess that's a relatively quick turnaround time. But it was frustrating because I always felt it was 2 weeks away. But that's always the case of software development.
Is this another app that you shipped with monetization built in, or was this another marketing play that you had in mind?
No, it was definitely always intended for monetization. I did wrestle with how to monetize it, because as you look around the landscape in 2019, most apps are moving to subscription. So that was definitely something I considered for ActionDash. Ultimately, I rejected it. Because I do think there's something to this simplicity of ActionDash's one-time in-app purchase. It may be something that I explore down the road. I have sort of considered maybe doing a sort of subscription for all of my apps, and giving. There's all sorts of different things I've sort of pondered. I don't know that I'll actually do it, but it's something that's always sort of rattling in my head. But yeah, ActionDash from the get-go was intended, from launch has had its its one-time in-app purchase, and that's where basically all the revenue came from. I have experimented a bit with different revenue methods, specifically AdMob.
Okay,
it's. I don't know. Have you guys had anyone talk about that over the years?
I don't think I've had experience with AdMob success in the past, but I don't think we've ever talked about it on the show.
Yeah, it was. I went down to a Google sort of developer day thing at Google Australia last year, and it was mostly game developers there. But they I definitely came away thinking, well, maybe I should definitely have another look at this at ads, because that's where a lot of game developers make the vast majority of their money. But I didn't love the way the ads you had to put in to really make the money. And by that I'm talking about the full screen interstitials and that sort of stuff.
Right.
They're quite a jarring experience, and I am conscious of the fact that there's like whenever you visit a site or a blog or listen to this podcast, like the ad is part of the content. You can't necessarily say, oh well, that's entirely a third party. Ultimately, there is some responsibility for the person putting the content out to ensure that the ads, that anything that's in your app is representing you in a way. And so I didn't, and I still don't love full screen interstitials and that sort of stuff for that reason. But AdMob did have they were introducing a new native API. So rather than those horrible banners you'd see at the bottom of ads that are rendered in web views, it allowed you to render it entirely as you see fit. AdMob will give you the the button action, the headline, the subject, and maybe a thumbnail image and a promo image, and details like that. And so I thought, okay, well, this could be something that is worth exploring, because like in ActionDash, you're seeing a list of ads anyway. A list of apps anyway. Maybe it would work to put put some native ads there. And so that's something that I have experimented with, but I actually ripped it out just yesterday. The code's still there, but I disabled it because it was making just such a pitiful amount of money. And it just wasn't. I just didn't like it because I do want to go back and A/B test it to see whether it's a case where having the ads in indirectly affects revenue by encouraging people to buy plus to get rid of them. So I would like some data around that. But I was very disappointed with how AdMob's native ads went for me. And I do think a part of it is my conservative implementation, and but I spent a lot of time trying to make sure that those ads looked nice and worked well, and that was time that, well, frankly, had I known that now, then ActionDash probably would have released last December, like I intended. But anyway.
Yeah, ads are one of those weird things that it's really difficult to make a decent amount of money on them unless you have a lot of scale. Like if you can get to scale, then you can really make I've seen companies make a lot of money off of ads, but getting there is very difficult. And like you said, and also making it fit within the experience of your app, so it's tailored to look decent, is also very difficult too, because you could get some really shoddy ads sometimes.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of. I read this article not long ago about ad makers like adjusting the background on their ad to make it look like the phone had a hair on the screen, so people would try and wipe the hair away, and
what
register
the hell? Wow,
yeah,
so good.
Yeah.
It's so good that it's bad.
Yeah,
I know it's kind of a genius idea, but like, oh god, that's like, yeah.
I've probably clicked on one of those ads. I almost guarantee it.
I didn't want to. It
it's
feels like to really
shady.
make it a success, I had to go down a path I don't want to go down, so I just turned it off.
So let me ask you this question. I originally asked you a while ago about how this is the original Wellbeing app was only for Pixel devices or so forth, but you said you've actually exposed this to all Android devices. How is that possible when only Google is only able to release it for some? Is there some magic that you're doing, or how are you able to do that?
Well, I don't know why Google doesn't release the app for all Pi devices. There were a few usage events that Google added for Android Pi, but you can get those through other ways. Like, for instance, Action Launcher. In Android Pi, they introduced the notification interruption event. That didn't exist on earlier versions of Android. But you can get that via the notification listener. and calculate it yourself. So there's I can understand why why Google used MinSDK 28. I can't understand locking it to Pixel and Android One phones, but I am very happy to benefit from that decision.
You're like, it works for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had some questions around like specifically the app implementation perspective, right?
Yeah.
So you mentioned, initially I think you mentioned like, oh, you were planning to write like you wrote like your unit tests to make sure like there was like a proof of concept per se. Can you like dive into like, I like this idea a lot. So was it more like hacking around like an app that has stuff, or was it like actual tests that you would run? Was it like UI tests, espresso tests? Were you testing like it against different APIs on Android to make sure like the APIs were available, or you were getting data? What was that process like?
So that specifically, basically, I wrote code that outputted all the usage events from my device to JSON, and then I just loaded that JSON in a unit test.
Interesting.
So basically, I have a usage stats repository in my project, and the implementation in the unit tests pulls those results from JSON, but then there's a system implementation that pulls the events directly from the system, and then there's also the actual repository that's used is a combination of system and cache and pulling stuff from a Room database.
Got it. Oh, that makes sense. Speaking about like a Room database and stuff, is there like a server component to this app, or does it all like build like just locally, like, or do you send it to like a backend to run like some analysis that's not possible on the phone, or is it like all completely native on the phone?
It's all completely on the phone. There's a few reasons for that. One is certainly as far as the business model goes, there's just no way I could do the one-time in-app purchase if I had ongoing server costs.
I see. That makes sense. Yeah.
So there's that, but there's also I quite like the privacy implications of the fact that it's all done on device, because the data, I never transfer it. The only time it ever leaves your device is if you do a manual backup.
That makes sense, especially like, given like the whole privacy consciousness that like you mentioned before. It's definitely like the route to go, right?
Yeah, I feel like there's advantages to it. Now that's not to say I might never do something going forward with ActionDash. I think there's obviously the opportunity. Like for me, I'd be interested in the same way I was interested to find out how many times I'm unlocking my phone. I'd be interested to know how much time do I spend a week on using my I pray it doesn't break today Nexus player. And it might be interesting to sort of sync those, and there would need to be a cloud component there. But I don't know. That's but for now, no, there's no cloud component at all.
And I notice you have like a plethora of features. Like you have like every feature that Android like has, right? Like app shortcuts, like the daily notifications, a whole bunch of these things. And like I noticed like a lot of like the graphs that you have, like they're really, really slick. So I had like some questions around that. For all the graphing, the UI stuff, do you just like use like libraries that help with some of that stuff?
Yeah.
And how do you keep abreast with like all the stuff that Android has? Like Android has a bajillion features now, right? And it seems somehow that you've like knocked every single thing and used it very appropriately for your app. Do you put a lot of thought into like saying, okay, this is an API that I think I could do something interesting with? Or is it more like, oh, I need this in my product. What's the best API that can serve that? How do the thought processes go around?
I definitely try to keep abreast of the Android libraries, any new Android libraries that come along. I will, certainly at least have a read of the GitHub library and that sort of stuff of pretty much anything that comes through in Android Weekly. The graph question, there's a terrific graphing library called, I think it's MP Android Chart or MP Chart Android, one of those two. It's a massive repository. I think it's got like 20,000 stars or something. So that was used as the base. There are a few extensions made as far as like the nice curves on the circle on the pie chart and on the bar graphs and that sort of stuff for ActionDash. But I absolutely, for ActionDash and for all my apps, I make heavy use of open source libraries. It's just it's such a massive advantage that Android has. And when I think back to my time in games development, like we had to write everything, and oftentimes even in the same company we'd end up every game would have its own camera system and that sort of stuff. Whereas it's just so lovely to just be able to take a piece of this that someone else has written, and chances are they probably fixed 3 other things that you wouldn't have thought of if you'd done it yourself. So yeah, it's just such a blessing, the Android open source community.
And looking back, what was probably the most difficult, like, if you had to look back and say like, oh, having developed ActionDash, what was the most difficult thing that you thought you had to like overcome as like from the development perspective?
The first thing that comes to mind is an issue that ended up not being an issue but caused me a huge amount of pain, and that was basically, as I mentioned, the first thing I did with ActionDash was write unit tests to make sure ActionDash was displaying the same results as digital wellbeing, and I thought, okay, I've ticked that box. And then as I started to near release, I started noticing some strange stats in the Google Digital Wellbeing app, and different results basically. And I was pulling my hair out, going, what's happening here? My code hasn't changed. The unit tests are the same now as they were, when I started. What's going on here? And eventually, so I spent a bit of time digging into it, and I manually parsed every single usage event and was in a Google sheet and incrementing looking at the timestamps and going, well, I don't understand how Google can be saying I'm using this app for 41 minutes when I'm saying I feel like it's a second, and it was literally that difference. And so I spent ages on this. I spent ages digging into it, and eventually I came to the conclusion that it must be a bug in Google's app. And I rolled back to the betas, and sure enough, in the betas, everything worked fine. Now that's generally not the way things go. You don't, you fix bugs in betas for the public release, not break them. But I was really confident here because this is what we were showing in ActionDash. This is what it was showing when I removed ActionDash completely and just manually inspected the data, and this is what it was showing in the early betas. So I felt like something was broken in Google's app, and so then I spent a while, and I emailed a Googler buddy about it, and he was good and passed it on to the digital wellbeing team, and then literally the day before release, I was driving to lunch and I noticed an update from the digital wellbeing app and installed it, and all of a sudden this issue that I had spent days digging into. I spent days writing a public blog post where I was going to say the values are different, but that's because I believe Google's wrong. And when you're doing that publicly, you really want to make sure your ducks are in a row.
Right.
And so I literally spent 2 days on that blog post, and so I had to and I had to go and update all my my press release assets and all sorts of stuff because this bug suddenly got fixed. So that was definitely painful, and that was probably if that hadn't happened, I do think I could have probably released last year, but I don't know. I keep saying that, but then that ignores the reality of just how much time it took me to get ActionDash ready for release, as far as because it's not enough to release an app. I think you have to have a strategy for how people are going to hear about the app. And for me, I remember when I was in game development, I remember reading this article about this small development house that had built like a Game Boy Advance game, and so they ended up having like $100,000 left over or something like that, which should never happen. But anyway, they said, well, rather than putting it in development, we're just going to put that in marketing because it's just going to be better to spend that way. And at the time, as a game developer, I thought that was madness. But it always struck with me because I think you in life, like I read this tweet recently, and it's one of those ones that really stuck with me. And it basically said, "We're all in sales," and that can be, when you go into a your annual performance review, you're selling yourself. It doesn't matter what you do when you talk to someone at a bar for a first time. Like there's everyone is in sales to a certain degree. You don't have to be a used car salesman to fit that description. And so I ended up spending a lot of time on ActionDash on trying to sell it, on trying to make it an app that you could tell the story of it in a GIF that's embedded in my launch tweet, that creating assets that look good, so that blog posts want to run them. Writing a demo usage stats repository like that's another one. Another usage stats repo is the demo one, which just picks, okay, it's going to be Netflix and WhatsApp and whatever I thought were the most popular apps people used on that particular day. So stuff like that, it takes a lot of time that I never did it previously, but I do feel it's time well spent.
Yeah, I saw when this was launched. I mean, and to kind of back up this here, you were your app is listed on like 9 to 5 Google, This Week in Tech, Android Police, Engadget, Android Authority. The list goes on and on and on. Did you reach out to each one of these publications individually? Did you have a PR firm, or was it just picked up organically?
I didn't reach out to every single one, but certainly I reached out to The Verge. And yeah, they've done a few articles on my apps over the years, and they were receptive here, so that was really exciting. And Android Central and Android Police, I reached out to a few others. I can't remember offhand. But generally, what I find is that once a few of the blogs run it, the others tend to. But I mean, it really depends on the app and what they think their readership wants to read about. I think it's easier an easier pitch. I think you're more likely to get coverage if there's something unique about the app. Like it's those articles are not me, as I said before, they're not me releasing a calculator app. It's not Android, indie Android developer releases calculator app. Like I don't think anyone's going to care. It's all about the app itself. I find if I focus on making it hopefully an exciting app that people will want to use, then the press coverage comes from there.
That's fascinating.
So,
and I mean, also, I just want to quickly say, for folks who don't know, ActionDash is a super polished app. So well done on that. Just hearing you say these things, I can tell like the amount of work that's gone into it. Like just seeing all the demos. So I mean, well done on that.
It's not fun. like there's definitely I have days where I'm just like I did not get into this to spend my time making GIFs, but it really is. As I sort of bring it back to that example where I spoke about the Game Boy Advance developers, there's every chance that 20 hours, 40 hours, 60 hours, whatever it was closer to the latter. That was the most beneficial time I spent on in the whole project's development, and I really, as I go, start, the longer I've been doing this, I just really try to not think of that time as an afterthought and something that I'll bolt together. I'm going to release it tomorrow at 9 a.m. my time, and I'll start it at 11 p.m. the night before. And that's what I did for the longest time, which was terrible because I can't work late. Like I once it gets to 7 p.m. I need to go to bed these days. So relying on doing all of that in my worst hours of the day is not a good idea, and it's something that I really make an effort to do a better job at going forward. But I do appreciate, Don, the backhand, not backhand, the compliment that there was ever an implication it came from a PR firm. That gives me a big smile.
No, yeah, no problem at all. I was really highly impressed where, I mean, I saw the coverage. That's very amazing. And I heard this quote from my friend Rob Walling, and I must have heard this close to 7-8 years ago. And it still holds true in my opinion to this day, is that like when you're going to build an app, then you want to, monetize it or whatever, building the application is 30 to 40% of the problem. And, 50 to 60% of the problem is sales and marketing, getting it out there. Because like you said, you can release it at, 9:00 tomorrow morning, start the promotion stuff tonight. And it's not even really do anything, but you put in a significant amount of thought and effort into promoting it. And it's got you a lot of coverage, which these publications have massive readership. And so it's just exposed you to just a tremendous amount of traffic. So kudos to you.
Yeah, it's. I would definitely encourage anyone who's interested in the space to just, keep this in your thoughts. And by all means, if you want to discuss it further with me, I'm always on Twitter. But it's just definitely not an afterthought, and not something that happens by accident, and not something that's enjoyable, but is something that is worthwhile to the project.
So I got a couple of questions here, and then we'll kind of wrap this up here. One of which is something I think that most people don't think about when they get into indie development, apps or anything like that, and they're selling something. And that's the admin and the support of applications that are of your scale and magnitude. How much time would you say that you spend supporting your applications, and what tools do you use to support them? Do you use any help tools like Help Scout or anything like that? And I mean, do you have support staff, or do you do it all yourself?
I'd actually be interested to hear how both of you guys approach this. But in my experience, like I've tried a few things over the years. I tried Zendesk. I hated that UI. I used Front for a while, which I actually think is a really terrific app, but it was just too expensive for me to justify. It's a dedicated sort of customer support service that has really good canned replies and that sort of stuff, and I think it was very good, but it's and for a while I tried to do the bulk of that myself. And I've been through a few phases over the years where, all right, I'm just going to spend, however much time a day doing this. And it's beneficial, but then I get to the point where I circle back to the fact that, well, hang on, I spent, 6, 7, 8 hours on support this week. That's 6, 7, 8 hours. I haven't made the app better for everyone. Is that the best use of my time? So I do have a guy who handles the Action Launcher support, so that's definitely freed that off my plate. So that's definitely helpful. But it's a constant it's a constant challenge, because there's absolutely benefits from manning that support list yourself. Like there's nothing like reading different people send through the same issue to really make you think, all right, I've got to get on that one. So it's a constant balance. I don't know the answer. My answer is I sort of flip back and forth between delegating, all of it to, being hands-on myself. But I'd say I'm generally always very responsive on Twitter. That's generally pretty consistent. But I do not profess to being a bastion of advice on this one.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, for me, for the products that I run, I use Help Scout, which is my support system. It's just simple. It's minimalistic. It's worth every dime, in my opinion. It's one of those ones. I think it's the minimalistic approach that it has is actually one of its benefits. And then I'm the same as you. I have a support representative that works for me on a part-time basis, and all level 1 support goes through him, and anything that he can't answer, that will get escalated to me. And then if I can, I'll set up a system or a process where he can then take care of it at that point. But if it's something that actually needs my integration, then it will always turn into a level 2 support ticket that gets picked up by me. So it's just kind of very similar to you.
Sounds like you are also a listener of the Tim Ferriss podcast.
You could say that.
Yeah, I wish I had a response to that, but like, yeah, for us, it's like just so different because unlike you guys, I don't think I've actually worked at like, I've never had to like field those questions on something that I've built on my own, but it sounds exciting. So
it's, like Chris said, it's one of those things where I do the same thing. I'll hop back and forth sometimes. Like, I'm going to spend a lot of time hammering this out, being one-on-one with the customers, and the customers love that. But at the end of the day, sometimes it's not really the best use of my time because just like Chris says, I'll look back and it's like, wow, I spent 8, 10, 12, 16 hours on support this week. I didn't even get this feature done I needed to get done. And now it's pushed off again. And so you have to be able to like say, all right, I know I can answer these 5 questions really fast, but so can my support guy. I'm going to leave them there. He'll get them in a couple of hours or in a half an hour or whatever. So it's just kind of those delegating things. Last question for you, Chris. You, and this kind of relates back to the risks that you had of creating a new application and the time frame that you were going to get it out in. You had a lot of history and a lot of, I guess a lot of experience with Java over the years with Action Launcher. And now it comes to ActionDash. I heard you mention something about Room. Did you use Kotlin in ActionDash, and did you find that moving to a new language and all these new libraries all at once, did it impact your productivity at all? Or did you find yourself like was there like an initial impact that eventually tapered off and allowed you to go faster? Or what was your experience?
That's a good question. I'd say that's something that I have struggled with historically. Like I remember when I first had my first job doing the iPad development, I remember I was essentially learning Objective-C, Xcode, and how to use a Mac at the same time, and the iOS APIs. And there was so much, and there was a really big there was a big learning curve there. I think as far as ActionDash is 100% Kotlin, and that's the first Kotlin I've ever written.
Nice.
And I definitely had a lot of cases where certainly in that first period where you look at the code literally you wrote 3 days ago and you're like, oh, I know how to do that better now. And that's tremendously exciting. And ActionDash used a lot of libraries that I was familiar with but hadn't actually used before. Room certainly being one of them. And no, actually that's not true. Room is used in parts of Action Launcher, but there's the new navigation library, and there's a lot of ActionDash code that uses libraries that I'm not necessarily familiar with, that I wasn't necessarily familiar with at starting with. But I didn't find it a massive learning curve this time because I think it's still in Android Studio. So much is similar in that regard. I was, familiar with Dagger. The code itself is anyone who's browsed the IO Shed app would feel extremely at home in ActionDash's code. I found that to be really advantageous to essentially take a code base that was functioning and worked, and maybe I don't agree with every design decision, but I don't care. I know this is it's far better to just go with a system that is proven, and if I really feel the need to change something, I can do it down the road. But there was just such a nice abstraction, in that app as far as between the presentation layer and domain layer and data layer, and that's not something that I have done nearly a good enough job at in Action Launcher over the years. And there's a few historical reasons for that. I think the main one is the fact that Action Launcher is derived from the AOSP launcher project, and that project was started long before Google were embracing tests, shall we say? So there's a lot of statics and that sort of stuff. And I think if I'm being honest with myself, and actually I should say, one of the things that I find most helpful with being within indie development is you have to be very honest with yourself. I spend most of my day telling myself how much I suck, but is the honest truth. And you have to do that because there's no one else around to do it, and it's sort of just to really push you. But so the I think I answered everything of your question there as far as Kotlin. There wasn't a big big overheads for me with ActionDash, despite just how unique it was.
That's excellent. That's cool. Thank you for answering that.
Chris, this has been amazing, and I know we're already gone past our 40-minute mark, way past our 40-minute mark. Thank you so much. I know we can go for another half an hour and 40 minutes, and Don and I have pretty much asked only half of the questions we have.
Oh, look,
but we
I'm certainly happy to come back another time. Before we wrap up, can I just say one thing?
Mm-hmm.
I am actually looking to hire someone because ActionDash and Action Launcher are both in a good spot. So if any budding developers want to help me build them, then please reach out.
Fantastic. And I can for sure say this is an opportunity that budding Android developers should definitely not let pass. Chris he's an icon in the Android developer industry. So this is, if there's very few better chances to learn, then so definitely a plug there. Chris, is there anything else you think? Obviously, ActionDash folks and listeners should definitely check it out. What are some of the other places you'd like our listeners to maybe head to that we can point them towards?
The review page on ActionDash on the Play Store.
5 stars, only 5 stars.
Yes.
Nothing else.
No. Look, I as I mentioned, I'm pretty active on Twitter, so you can always find me there. And look, if you want to check out my apps, and if you want to look at applying, then email you should hire me at actionlauncher.com, and we'll have a chat.
Fantastic, Chris. Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about these apps. This is an honor and a pleasure for us.
That's been great.
Oh, my pleasure. Hopefully I'll catch up with you both at I/O.
Absolutely. Don, if folks want to find out what you're doing and what you have up your sleeve, what's a good place to do that?
The best place is either on Twitter or Instagram, and it's just at my name, at Don Felker. And Kaushik, what about you if folks want to reach out to you and see what you're up to?
Kaushik Gopal on most of the services should usually work. So Twitter is usually a good place for me to get in touch with folks. Thank you all so much for listening. Chris, again, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was so much fun.
Anytime.
Thank you all for listening. We will catch you in the next episode.
Before we get going, we'd like to thank our sponsor for this episode, and that is nevercode.io. If you're looking for a continuous integration platform that supports Flutter right out of the box, even with Bitbucket and GitLab integration coming soon, you'll want to check out nevercode.io. They also recently released the automatic code signing for iOS, which allows you to not have a Mac to develop a iOS app from your Flutter project, which is awesome. If you're interested, go ahead and check out nevercode.io for a 14-day free trial. And if you're interested in CodeMagic, please go to codemagic.io. Thanks, Nevercode.
I want to thank Sentry for sponsoring today's show. Their tagline is, "Your code is broken, let's fix it together." They're a super cool crash reporting service that gives you all the helpful details that you need when detecting and fixing errors in your application. Don't wait for your users to report your errors and crashes. Use Sentry to catch them earlier. Check them out at sentry.io/for/Android. Once again, because Sentry is a common word, I want to make sure you get it right. Sentry.io. My thanks to Sentry for sponsoring today's show. That's it for the show, folks. Fragmented is hosted by Don Felker and me, Kaushik Gopal. We edit and produce all the episodes here on Fragmented. Sarah the Amazing Jackson from the Spec Network helps with production assistance and wraps our final mix. Our theme and ad music is by the national recording artist Blueprint from Weightless Recordings. You can find more Fragmented episodes at fragmentedpodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you in the next episode.